Greetings and welcome back to the Global Business Channel. Thank you for joining us today for our 40-second channel video. In this one, we'll be discussing Recommendation 7 of the Financial Action Task Force's 40 recommendations concerning targeted financial sanctions related to proliferation financing in Part C of the FATF Recommendation Handbook. Additionally, we'll be reviewing the 13 interpretative notes accompanying Recommendation 7, found on pages 53 to 59 of the handbook. We publish weekly videos on topics related to the offshore global business, corporate, financial, and compliance sectors. We encourage you to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up if you find these topics interesting. Lastly, for ease of reference, all videos are arranged in playlists which we have created on various subject matters, so feel free to browse through them. Without further delay, let's get started with today's video. Countries must implement targeted financial sanctions in line with United Nations Security Council resolutions to prevent, suppress, and disrupt the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction or WMDs and related financial activities. These resolutions mandate that countries immediately freeze the funds or assets of any individual or entity designated by or under the authority of the United Nations Security Council, ensuring no funds or assets are directly or indirectly made available to such persons or entities. These actions are required under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. For background and reference purposes, let's take a few moments to cover the UN Security Council and Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. The United Nations Security Council, or UNSC, is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations tasked with maintaining international peace and security. It has the authority to make binding decisions on member states, including sanctions, peacekeeping missions, and the authorization of military action. The UNSC is composed of 15 members, 5 permanent ones being China, France, Russia, the UK, and the United States, with veto power, and 10 non-permanent members elected for 2-year terms. Its decisions play a central role in conflict resolution and global security initiatives. Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, on the other hand, allows the United Nations Security Council to take enforcement action to maintain or restore international peace and security. It provides the UNSC with the authority to determine threats to peace, breaches of peace, or acts of aggression, and to take military and non-military measures, such as sanctions or the use of force, to address such threats. This chapter empowers the UNSC to act decisively, including authorizing military interventions to ensure global security. It is crucial for managing conflicts and responding to international crises. We will now be reviewing and summarizing the 13 interpretative notes accompanying Recommendation 7. Interpretative Note 1 regarding the recommendation's objective states that Recommendation 7 requires countries to enforce targeted financial sanctions to comply with United Nations Security Council resolutions, particularly those related to preventing the financing of weapons of mass destruction or WMDs. This involves, number 1, freezing assets. Countries must freeze the funds and assets of individuals or entities designated by the UNSC without delay. Number 2, prohibition of funds, ensuring that no funds or assets are made available to the designated persons or entities. Number 3, relevant resolutions, adhering to UNSC resolutions focused on WMD proliferation financing, including those like Resolutions 1718 of the year 2006 and 2231 of the year 2015. Number 4, guidance and future resolutions. Considering the FATF's non-binding guidance for implementing these targeted financial sanctions and being prepared for future UNSC resolutions related to WMD Proliferation financing. As always, for reference and background purposes, let's talk about some of the key terms that we just went over. UNSC Resolution 1718 was adopted in 2006 in response to North Korea's nuclear tests. It imposes sanctions to curb the country's nuclear weapons program, including a ban on the export of arms and luxury goods to North Korea, and freezing the assets of individuals and entities involved in the nuclear program. More access and information to this resolution can be viewed by accessing the link shown on the screen. UNSC Resolution 2231, adopted in 2015, endorsed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, which aimed to limit Iran's nuclear program. It terminated previous sanctions related to Iran's nuclear activities while imposing new restrictions and monitoring mechanisms to ensure compliance with the JCPOA. More access, once again, and information to this resolution can be viewed by accessing the link shown on your screen. Interpretative Note 2, still concerning the recommendation's objective, stipulates that the obligations under Recommendation 7 are separate from existing international treaties or Security Council resolutions related to weapons of mass destruction, non-proliferation, such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention, the Chemicals Weapons Convention, and the United Nations Security Council resolutions 1540 of the year 2004, 2325 of the year 2016, and 1540 of the year 2004. While those obligations focus on legal processes for investigations or proceedings, Recommendation 7 emphasizes preventive measures to stop the flow of funds or assets to entities involved in WMD proliferation, as mandated by the UN Security Council. Once again, let's take a moment to cover the treaties we just mentioned a few seconds earlier, which is important in the context of this interpretative note to Recommendation 7. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, which came into effect in 1970, is a key international treaty aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, promoting peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and advancing nuclear disarmament. It is based on 3 main pillars. Number 1, non-proliferation. Nuclear-armed countries agree not to transfer nuclear weapons or related technology to non-nuclear armed states, and non-nuclear armed states agree to not pursue nuclear weapons. Number 2, disarmament. The treaty commits nuclear-armed states to work toward eventual nuclear disarmament. Number 3, peaceful use of nuclear energy. The treaty encourages cooperation in the peaceful use of nuclear technology while ensuring that such activities do not contribute to nuclear weapons development. The NPT has near universal membership, with 191 states as parties, but notable exceptions include India, Pakistan, and Israel, who are not signatories. North Korea withdrew from the treaty in 2003. The treaty is reviewed every 5 years to assess the progress on these goals. The Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, or BTWC, also known as the Biological Weapons Convention, or BWC, is an international treaty that prohibits the development, production, and stockpiling of biological and toxin weapons. Entering into force in the year 1975, it was the first multilateral disarmament treaty banning an entire category of weapons. Key aspects of the BTWC include: number one, prohibition. States parties are banned from acquiring or retaining biological agents or toxins for non-peaceful purposes. Number two, destruction. Any existing stockpiles of biological weapons must be destroyed or diverted to peaceful uses. Number three, compliance and review. States meet regularly to review compliance and discuss strengthening the convention, although the BTWC lacks a formal verification mechanism to ensure compliance. The convention has been ratified by 185 countries, with a few states yet to join, making it a cornerstone in the global effort to prevent the use of biological agents as weapons. The Chemicals Weapons Convention, or CWC, is an international treaty that bans the development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons. Adopted in 1993 and enforced 4 years later in 1997, it is one of the most comprehensive arms control agreements, aimed at eliminating an entire category of weapons. Key features of the CWC include: number one, prohibition. States parties are required to destroy all chemical weapons and production facilities under their control. Number two, verification. The treaty has a robust verification regime overseen by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW, to ensure compliance through inspections and monitoring. And number three, destruction timeline. Member states are obliged to destroy their chemical weapons within specific deadlines, and many have already completed this process. The CWC has 193 member states and is considered one of the most successful disarmament treaties in history. The OPCW, its implementing body, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in the year 2013 for its efforts in eliminating chemical weapons. Now going over some of the other UN Security Council resolutions that were mentioned in Interpretative Note 2, starting with 1540 of the year 2004, which requires all UN member states to prevent non-state actors, including terrorists, from acquiring weapons of mass destruction, their means of delivery, and related materials. The resolution mandates countries to enact and enforce laws to stop the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, ensure effective export controls, and promote international cooperation to prevent WMD terrorism. It is a key measure in global non-proliferation efforts. UN Security Council Resolution 2325 of the year 2006 strengthens the implementation of the previous resolution we just discussed, being 1540, which addresses the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. It emphasizes the need for full national implementation of non-proliferation measures, improved export controls, and stronger international cooperation to prevent non-state actors from acquiring WMDs. The resolution also encourages states to voluntarily share best practices, assist other countries with capacity building, and ensure that appropriate legal and regulatory measures are in place to counter WMD proliferation. Interpretative Note 3 concerns designations. It asserts that designations of individuals or entities are made by the UN Security Council or its established committees through annexes to relevant resolutions. While there is no formal requirement for UN member states to submit designation proposals, the Security Council and its committees typically rely on member states to make these requests. Resolution 1718 instructs the relevant committee to create guidelines for implementing sanctions, while Resolution 2231 assigns the Security Council direct responsibility for tasks related to implementing that resolution. Interpretative Note 4, still on the same subject matter, argues that countries should consider setting up legal authority and effective mechanisms to propose individuals or entities for designation under Security Council resolutions. These designations would apply targeted financial sanctions to prevent the financing of weapons of mass destruction proliferation. Countries are encouraged to contemplate specific elements when establishing such processes. Subnote A stipulates that countries designate a competent authority, either executive or judicial, responsible for proposing individuals or entities for designation to the 1718 Sanctions Committee or the Security Council. These proposals should be based on the criteria established in relevant Security Council resolutions, such as Resolution 1718 and Resolution 2231. The authority should propose such designations if they have sufficient evidence to meet the criteria. Subnote B asserts that countries should establish mechanisms to identify potential targets for designation according to the criteria specified in Security Council resolutions such as 1718 and 2231, as well as their successors. These mechanisms must ensure that authorities determine whether there is sufficient reason or basis to propose a designation based on national or supranational principles. Subnote C suggests that countries should have the necessary legal authority, along with procedures or mechanisms, to gather or request information from all relevant sources. This would help identify individuals and entities that, on reasonable grounds or suspicions, are believed to meet the designation criteria outlined in the relevant Security Council resolutions. Subnote D argues that when deciding whether to propose a designation, countries should follow the criteria outlined in Section E of the Interpretative Note. Each country's competent authority will apply its own legal standards while considering human rights, the rule of law, and protecting rights of innocent third parties. Subnote E explains that when countries propose name for designation to the 1718 Sanctions Committee or the Security Council, they should provide detailed information. This includes 1. Sufficient identifying details to ensure accurate identification of individuals or entities, and 2. Specific evidence showing that the person or entity meets the designation criteria outlined in relevant Security Council resolutions. And subnote F specifies that countries should have procedures in place to act unilaterally if needed against an individual or entity that has been identified and is under consideration for designation. Section C concerns freezing and prohibiting dealings in funds or other assets of designated persons and entities, and Interpretative Note 5 states that countries are required to promptly enforce targeted financial sanctions against individuals and entities designated by the UN Security Council or its 1718 Sanctions Committee under Resolution 1718 and its successors, and by the Security Council under Resolution 2231, as well as any future resolutions passed under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Interpretative Note 6, still on the same subject matter, stipulates that countries should create the required legal powers and designate domestic authorities responsible for enforcing and implementing targeted financial sanctions following these standards and procedures. A. Countries, and in the case of the EU, under EU law, should require all individuals and organizations within their borders to immediately freeze the funds or assets of designated persons or entities without prior notice. This applies to number 1, all funds or assets owned or controlled by the designated person or entity, not just those linked to a specific terrorist act or threat. Number 2, funds or assets jointly owned or controlled directly or indirectly by the designated persons or entities. Number 3, funds or assets generated from or connected to those owned or controlled by the designated persons or entities, as well as those held by individuals or entities acting on their behalf or under their direction. B. Countries should forbid their citizens and anyone within their borders from providing funds, assets, economic resources, or financial services, whether directly or indirectly, fully or partially, to benefit 1. Designated persons or entities, 2. Entities owned or controlled by them, 3. People or entities acting on their behalf or under their direction. This is unless it is specifically allowed or approved according to relevant Security Council resolutions. C. Countries should have systems to immediately inform the financial sector and the NFBPs, otherwise meaning designated non-financial businesses and professions, when designations are made. They should also give clear instructions, especially to financial institutions and entities holding targeted funds or assets on their responsibilities when freezing those assets. D. Countries should require financial institutions and DNFBPs to report any frozen assets or actions taken to comply with Security Council resolutions, including attempted transactions, to the relevant authorities. These authorities should effectively use the reported information. E. Countries should implement effective measures to protect the rights of genuine third parties acting in good faith while carrying out the obligations under Recommendation 7. F. Countries should implement measures to monitor and ensure that financial institutions and the NFBPs comply with laws related to Recommendation 7. Non-compliance with these laws should result in civil, administrative, or criminal penalties. Section D concerns delisting, unfreezing, and providing access to frozen funds or other assets, and Interpretative Note 7 asserts that countries should create publicly available procedures to request the removal of designated persons or entities from the UN Security Council sanctions list when they no longer meet the designation criteria. Once delisted, freezing obligations cease. For resolutions like the one 1718 and its successors, these procedures should follow guidelines from Resolution 1730 of 2006, as well as its successors, including the focal point mechanism. Countries should allow listed individuals and entities to submit delisting requests to this focal point or inform them that they can do so directly. Interpretative Note 8, still on the same subject matter, argues that countries should establish clear and publicly accessible procedures to unfreeze funds or assets in a timely manner for individuals or entities mistakenly affected by freezing measures, otherwise known as false positives. These procedures must ensure verification that the affected party is not the designated individual or entity under sanctions. Interpretative Note 9, still once again on the same subject matter, states that when countries determine that the exception conditions specified in UN Resolutions 1718 and Resolution 2231 are satisfied, they should authorize access to funds or assets following the procedures outlined in these resolutions. Interpretative Note 10, still on the same subject matter, stipulates that countries are required to allow the addition of interest, earnings, or payments to accounts frozen under UN Resolutions 1718 or 2231, as long as these earnings or payments stem from contracts or obligations established before the accounts were frozen. However, any added funds must remain unfrozen and subject to the same restrictions outlined in the resolutions. Interpretative Note 11, still on the same subject matter, asserts that payments under contracts made before the listing of a designated person or entity under Resolutions 1737 and 2231 can be allowed, provided that a. the contract is unrelated to prohibited materials or services outlined in the resolutions, b. the payment is not received by a designated person or entity under the restrictions in paragraph 6 of Annex B to Resolution 2231, and c. the relevant country must notify the UN Security Council of the payment or unfreezing of funds at least 10 days in advance, ensuring compliance with the necessary conditions. If this designated entity is a financial institution, the FATF guidance should also be considered. Interpretative Note 12 on the same subject matter asserts that countries must have systems in place to promptly inform the financial sector and DNFBPs when a delisting or unfreezing of assets occurs. These mechanisms ensure that the financial institutions and other relevant entities are aware of their obligations to respect such actions. Additionally, adequate guidance must be provided to assist them in properly implementing the delisting or unfreezing processes and ensuring compliance. And finally, the last Interpretative Note 13 on the United Nations designation criteria focuses specifically on North Korea and Iran and includes for North Korea, number 1, individuals or entities involved in North Korea's nuclear, WMD, and ballistic missiles programs. Number 2, those providing support to these programs through illicit means. Number 3, individuals or entities acting on behalf of or directed by designated persons or entities. Number 4, legal entities owned or controlled by these designated persons or entities. Number 5, individuals or entities assisting in sanction evasion or violating relevant UN resolutions. Number 6, contributors to North Korea's prohibited programs or activities or evading sanctions. And number 7, any North Korean government or Workers' Party entities associated with prohibited activities. These sanctions aim to curb North Korea's development of WMDs and ensure compliance with international regulations. Regarding Iran, here is what this interpretative note states. Number 1, individuals or entities involved in nuclear activities. Those directly participating in or supporting Iran's nuclear activities or developing nuclear weapon delivery systems, particularly in violation of the JCPOA commitments or through prohibited procurement. Number 2, entities aiding in sanction evasion. Persons or entities helping designated individuals evade sanctions or act contrary to the JCPOA or Resolution 2231. Number 3, associates and controlled entities. Those acting on behalf of or directed by the above-mentioned persons or entities owned or controlled by them. These measures aim to restrict nuclear proliferation and ensure adherence to international agreements on nuclear non-proliferation. That's it for today's video on Recommendation 7 issued by the Financial Action Task Force. Thank you for sticking around until the end. Your support means a lot to us, and we hope you found the information, insights, and key points valuable. We'll continue to share informative content every week, so don't hesitate to return to the Global Business channel for insightful videos on the offshore global, compliance, and financial services sectors. Take care, stay safe, and we'll catch you in the next one. Cheerios!